Lando Norris is standing in Parc Fermé after the Belgian Grand Prix, and he is not talking like a man who just won a title defense. He is talking like a man reading out a fault report. Blanchimont, he says, is where his car drops from 320 kilometers an hour to 270. Not because he lifted, not because he made a mistake, because the battery is dead. That sentence should not exist in Formula One. Blanchimont is not a corner where cars slow down. It is one of the fastest, most committed pieces of racetrack left in the sport, a place drivers have spent decades treating as a badge of courage. And the reigning world champion just told you his own car goes soft there because it runs out of electricity. This is F1 Verdict. I'm Ryan. And before you assume this is just a story about a battery, I want you to sit with something. Norris isn't really talking about the battery. He's talking about a problem his own team principal warned everyone was coming, days before a single lap was driven at Spa. Let's start with what actually happened on track, because the numbers here are not small. Under the 2026 regulations, the cars lean far more heavily on electrical deployment than they ever have before. And at a long, old-school circuit built in an era when engines just made power and kept making it, that dependency gets exposed instantly. Drivers found themselves lifting and coasting through sections they used to attack without a second thought. Not because the grip disappeared, because the energy did. Max Verstappen put it in blunt terms after the race. For most of the middle sector, he said, you are essentially running on the combustion engine alone, and in his estimation, that is somewhere in the range of a Formula 3 car's output. That is not a stopwatch reading. That is his gut sense of what it feels like behind the wheel. But think about what he is actually saying. The best drivers alive on one of the most demanding stretches of asphalt in the sport's history are describing the sensation of driving a junior category car. Verstappen even joked that if he said what he really believed about all this, someone would come and shoot him. He wasn't the only one thinking it. He was just the loudest about admitting it out loud. And then there's Norris, who didn't joke about it at all. He gave you an exact number, 320 kilometers an hour down to 270, in Blanchimont, because the battery is empty. That's the reigning champion, watching his own championship-winning car bleed 50 kilometers an hour off one of the fastest corners on the calendar, on the record, in front of cameras. His teammate Oscar Piastri didn't dress it up either. He said the 2026 package, in his words, sucks. And Carlos Sainz, who sits on the Drivers' Association, said the early simulations for these regulations already showed exactly where this was heading, and asked out loud how anyone could have signed off on it in the first place. 4 different teams, 4 different drivers, almost the exact same complaint in almost the exact same words. This wasn't one frustrated driver venting after a bad afternoon. This was a pattern, and it was happening in real time, on camera, at one of the most historic circuits Formula One has left. Here's where it gets interesting, though, because this wasn't actually a surprise, not to McLaren. Days before the Belgian Grand Prix ever started, McLaren team principal Andrea Stella went on record warning exactly what was coming. Spa-Francorchamps, he said, would be one of the most energy-starved tracks on the entire calendar, and the long straights would produce overtaking driven by energy deployment rather than genuine racing. He talked about straight mode zones, about areas where the car simply would not be allowed to deploy, about the specific technical bottlenecks that were about to collide with one of the fastest layouts in the sport. That's not a reaction, that's a warning, given before a single competitive lap was turned. And it came true almost exactly as described, down to the corners he named. So when Norris stands in Parc Fermé afterward and calls out the battery dying in Blanchimont, he's not handing you a fresh complaint. He's confirming something his own boss already told the world was coming. The only difference is that Stella's warning was quiet, buried in a preview piece easy to scroll past. Norris's version happened live, on the fastest part of the lap, in front of every camera at the circuit, and that's the part worth sitting with. Because a team principal predicting a problem is one thing, a team principal predicting a problem, being proven exactly right, and nobody with the power to change it doing anything about it, is a very different thing. Let's widen the lens for a second. Because the McLaren story doesn't exist in isolation, this wasn't the only strange thing that happened at Spa. Over on the German broadcast, commentators noticed the world feed kept cutting away from onboard cameras right as cars lost speed on the long straights, and the on-screen graphics for speed and battery level were largely absent for stretches of the race. One commentator asked on air why they didn't just stick with the shot. His colleague, a former driver himself, gave his own theory: because they don't want to show the drop in speed. Formula One responded to that on the record, denying any agenda and insisting nothing was being hidden. And here's the thing about that denial. Nobody forced them to answer a comment made in a German commentary booth. They chose to, which tells you they understood exactly how it looked. Now put that next to what Norris said, what Stella predicted, and what Verstappen and Piastri and Sainz all backed up independently. You start to see the shape of something bigger than one bad corner at one circuit. You start to see a car concept that was flagged as a problem before the race even started, that turned into a visible, embarrassing, on-camera failure during the race, and that the sport then had to publicly deny hiding. None of that proves a cover-up. I want to be honest about that because it matters. Full onboard footage was still available for anyone who looked for it. Those speed and energy graphics have shown up plenty of times across the season. Broadcast directors cut away from straights constantly, chasing whatever the more interesting battle happens to be elsewhere on track. Every individual clip has a boring, ordinary explanation. But here's what should actually worry the people running this sport. Lewis Hamilton, now driving for Ferrari, didn't get drawn into the battery argument at all. When asked about it, he pointed somewhere else entirely. Whoever wrote these rules, he said, they're still in their job. That's a 7-time champion saying on the record that nobody responsible for this outcome has faced any consequence for it. And Martin Brundle, a man who has called this sport for the better part of 4 decades, described the run-up over Eau Rouge and Raidillon as basically a flat-out straight now. He said it slightly broke his heart. He talked about having a tear in his eye watching one of the most famous sequences in motorsport get reduced to something the cars barely notice anymore. That's not a driver protecting lap time. That's the sport's own broadcaster mourning what used to make this place special. And here is the fact that ties every thread of this together, the one nobody is disputing. Back in June, before any of this happened at Spa, Formula One had already agreed to hand more raw engine power back to the cars for 2027 and 2028. The sport had already quietly signed off on watering down the very regulations everyone spent the Belgian weekend tearing apart in public. Spa didn't create that decision. It just showed everyone exactly why it had already been made. So here's the verdict, and I want to separate this carefully into 2 piles, because they get tangled together very easily. In the first pile, the part that is completely proven. The cars are so starved for deployment through certain sectors that multiple drivers compare them to a junior category. Andrea Stella predicted this specific failure days in advance, publicly, before it happened. The people responsible for writing these rules are, in Hamilton's words, still sitting in their jobs, and the sport has already agreed to change the regulations for the next 2 seasons. None of that is speculation. It's on the record. In the second pile, the part that is not proven. Whether the broadcast deliberately avoided showing the speed drop, that one stays open. It might be true. It might just be normal editorial decision-making that looks suspicious because the product underneath it is embarrassing. My honest read is this. Formula One doesn't need to hide the battery problem because it's already out in the open, coming directly out of the mouths of its own drivers and its own team principal, who called it before the race even began. The fact that the sport still felt the need to respond to a commentator's offhand remark tells you they know exactly how this looks from the outside. So I'll leave it to you the way I always do. Was Norris's line about the battery just a technical complaint, or was it the confirmation of a warning nobody wanted to act on? Tell me where you land in the comments, and keep an eye on the Hungarian Grand Prix this weekend. It's a slower, tighter circuit, where this exact energy problem should, in theory, be far less punishing. If these cars suddenly come alive in Budapest, the questions about what Stella warned everyone about at Spa are only going to get louder. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because this channel exists to find the reaction behind the headline, the quote nobody quoted in full, and the pattern the sport doesn't want connected. If this is the kind of breakdown you want more of, drop a like. It tells the algorithm to put this in front of more people who need to see it. Let me know in the comments which pile you land in, proven or not proven, because I read every single one. And if you want the next verdict the moment it drops, turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Until the next one.